Welcome back. As COVID-19 continues to impact the Bahamas, the government is working to contain the spread of the virus through this lockdown effort. Now, people have voiced complaints about the decision to lock the country down. Some of the measures put in place up to this point, including the grocery shopping list and making it a must that everyone wear masks outside of their residence. Tonight, we get the Democratic National Alliance view on how the government has handled the COVID-19 pandemic so far and what could be done to improve going forward. Please welcome leader of the DNA, Arinthia Komolafe. Thank you for joining me on the show tonight.
Thank you for having me, Clint. It's good to be here.
Obviously, in a nation like this, where we're so vulnerable to this disease, it has pointed out so many areas that we need to give considerable focus, not even long-term, but short-term coming out of this, obviously. What is your take on what we are seeing happening now, unfolding our country, even straight down to the panicking of Bahamians to try and stock up, Bahamians being locked down, wondering what will this do for us? What is the DNA's position on how we have gone through this process so far and what we need to do to get the message to Bahamians on a larger scale?
Well, Clint, this is a crisis of epic proportions, and I said that from the onset, and we can see that this is the direction that we were going to go in. As you mentioned in your opening salvo, this is very sobering for us. Those statistics are very sobering to remind us how vulnerable we are to this COVID-19. We are now at 41 cases, 8 deaths. That means that one in every five persons
Correct.
affected with COVID-19 is going to die. And that's the sobering message that's there. That mortality rate is not very comforting for those of us that are seeing it. In relations to the response, and I heard you also say in your opening salvo that social distancing is our only weapon and our only defense, and I have to beg to differ because, this virus became known to the world as early as December 19 when China alerted the WHO. And persons who have been in the field, epidemiologists, virologists, specialists in this field, have been monitoring this virus from as early as then. And the countries who got out of the gate early are the ones who are managing this crisis better now today. So you have countries like Germany who noticed the symptoms in the COVID-19. Even though it was not MERS, even though it was not SARS, they used some of the footprint from those particular viruses to be able to start to create tests very early. And so now they're doing a lot of mass testing. We saw countries in the Asian area, in the Asian bloc, near China, like South Korea, like Singapore, like Taiwan, who have very good cases, and China themselves, who have very good examples of how they were able to contain this virus because, one, they noticed and they started to move toward creating tests, and two, they started to monitor their borders and start the screening. Now, this virus has been here. It is obvious that this virus has been here for a couple of months now. And the fact that most of the cases that are being confirmed have no travel history, it was very clear early on that there had been community transmission. That means persons would have come into the country while the borders were open, the sea borders, the air borders, and they would have imported this virus here, which created the environment for the virus to be able to spread. And so we acted a little bit too late in terms of closing our borders. These lockdown measures are good now. They're good to stop the stem.
So you believe the government should have acted even earlier?
We ought to have acted earlier, and I'll tell you why. Because we know that we are an open economy. We know we have persons coming here from the United States, Europe, and Asia. We know that this virus was human to human from as early as January 2020. And we did not even have screening at our airports and at our seaports. We were not even taking the temperature of persons that were coming. True. At the minimum.
Many people were asking why we weren't doing it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, eventually we closed down our borders to China, but it wasn't until recently that we closed down our borders to the remainder of the world. And so obviously this created the environment for the virus to get in. Now you know that there's an incubation period of 2 days to 14 days.
Correct.
Right? And you know that there are a lot of persons now, as they are learning more about the virus, we know that there are a lot of asymptomatic persons, meaning persons who are not showing symptoms. And more research that is coming out day after day are showing that most of the persons that are being tested positive in a lot of these jurisdictions, in Iceland, 50% of the positive cases were asymptomatic. And that's very concerning for the experts because it's making it, when you don't know who's carrying this virus, it makes it that much more difficult to contain the virus, right? And they're also finding another disturbing trend that before those persons get to manifesting symptoms, they are what they call pre-symptomatic. They are finding that the virus is being transmitted at a more aggressive pace during these pre-symptomatic cases. So in the case of where we were on these long lines over the last couple of days because we came out of a 2-day lockdown and right into an alphabet system that perhaps sounded good in theory but really didn't work in practice. I myself personally stood on the line for 5 hours waiting to get inside the food store. I mean, in all of my years and living in the Bahamas, even in panic shopping for hurricane, I've never experienced anything like that. And then when I got inside, it took me another 2 hours just to get served. And I literally got out of the food store minutes before the 9 o'clock curfew and got home 9 o'clock on the dot. And what you saw there was everything that was contrary to social distancing. Going back to your point about the lockdown being our only defense, I disagree because what experts are saying around the world, and particularly the World Health Organization, the reason why that mortality rate is so high in the Bahamas is because we don't have the testing capacity.
And I wanted to get to that because, and perhaps what I probably should have said for clarity is it is our one defense that we all can do.
Absolutely.
And I wanted to make that clear because I know there are so many other ways we can do to bring this down. What I wanted to say is the one thing that we all can do collectively to fight this. And you brought in something I wanted to get to, which is testing. Because New Zealand is being hailed for having only one death. Even though they had many cases.
Yes.
And when they spoke to the Prime Minister of New Zealand as to what she was doing, and the response was, obviously, rapid testing. Testing more people so you know who was infected and how to deal with it. And then, of course, closing the borders sooner. So that's correct. And that's my question. Do you believe that we need to go into rapid testing?
Well, I don't know about the rapid testing because the rapid testing is different from this molecular test.
Correct.
Which is a bit more affirmative, right? The rapid testing could give you either a false positive or a negative positive.
True.
That's not what we want. Those countries that are ahead of the game are the countries that created those molecular tests early. New Zealand, Germany, Taiwan, Iceland. And so you will see that they may have high affected cases because of their mass testing, but they have low fatality rates, right? And they have more persons that are recovering. So I heard the good minister in the press statement yesterday saying that what they did, he said that it was nothing short of a miracle that we are able now to do our own tests locally. And this was just as a couple of weeks. Well, I'm very concerned about that because if we were watching from December, we should have been positioning ourselves to be able to put ourselves in a position to be able to do what he's saying we just did short of a miracle a couple of weeks ago. Being able to look at tests, having secure those tests if we can produce them locally to at least purchase them and stockpile on them. Now we are behind schedule and we are behind the line and we are not going to be able to contain this virus through just lockdowns. Lockdowns will stop the spread. Lockdowns may be able to get persons who are asymptomatic and with mild symptoms to cure faster, but lockdowns is not going to be the be-all and the end-all. We have to get the Bahamas to the point where it's having more testing and we are able to get those numbers up because right now we are flying blind. It's like the WHO head said, official said there, if you're not testing, it's like trying to fight a fire with a blindfold on your face.
Let's pause right there, take a break, and come back and talk more about this testing and why we need to do this. You're watching Beyond the Headlines. We're back after this. Stay close. Welcome back. We're talking about how the Bahamas is managing this pandemic with coronavirus, considering our death toll climbing again. I'm talking to the leader of DNA. And before the break, we were talking about the need for more testing to be able, and of course, for people who are wondering why people are so hung up on testing, the more you test, the more you have an idea of who's out there carrying it.
Absolutely.
And we know the government has said that this lockdown is particularly important to be able to find who the super spreaders are.
Yes.
And my question obviously is, how are you going to do that? What technique are you using to identify who the super spreaders are unless you're testing.
Absolutely, and you can only find that out through testing. Even all of the persons that are quarantined or who have been identified through contact tracing has not
Right.
been tested, and that's a challenge for us as well. But they need to move toward that. You know, even when America finally started and moved toward the lockdown, you know why New York is now saying they see glimmers of hope and they're looking like they're flattening the curve? Because the governor stood out there and he fought for tests. Do you know why Trump was able to declare a state of emergency? Because the local government and the state governors were calling for more testing capacity. CDC could not do it of its own. So what they had to do was they had to engage private firms, labs, to be able to produce more tests. The more tests you have, the more you have an idea of exactly where this virus is, how your spread is, not just identifying where your what your graph looks like by persons who have presented themselves or persons who are in quarantine, but absolutely knowing what is the extent of this virus in your country through testing, right? So I hear a lot the government is saying to the people, and the people need to follow suit, right? Because this virus is out there. And as we have already identified, there are a lot of asymptomatic carriers. We need to stay home. We need to stop the spread. We need to save lives. But at the same time, as the government is requiring us to be these warriors on the battle line, doing our part, they have to be out front there as well, getting the necessary resources that we need to be able to fight this case. It is not just going to be the lockdown alone. And I'll tell you why, even from an economic standpoint, why it's not just going to be the lockdown alone. But we have to get more of those tests, get more persons tested. That is absolutely crucial in us being able to fight this battle. This virus is not going anywhere. There's no vaccine. There's no cure. This lockdown, primarily why a lot of healthcare specialists have advised it, is to slow the spread, right? Because the incubation period is from 2 to 14, it's just to slow the spread. But it's not going to cause it to be eliminated. Now, if your country is going to be able to fight this battle, it needs to know exactly how many persons are impacted so that you can get to the point of moving toward recovery. If we don't do that, you know, and if I was the Minister of Finance, I'd be saying to the Minister of Health, look, what do you guys need? What are the resources that you need? Because I can't have this economy shut down forever.
Correct, because that's the question. People are wondering, how long are we going to do lockdowns trying to fight this? At some point, the economy has to begin to have life.
Absolutely.
And obviously, you're not going to wait until you eradicate every case to open the economy. We're now going to have to learn to live with an economy back up and running and still dealing with fighting coronavirus.
Absolutely. See, there are two things that are there. On the health side, we have to do those testings because, as you mentioned in your opening salvo, these persons basically have a fighting chance by the time as they're tested, right? And if we say that we have a high percentage of non-communicable diseases in the Bahamas, doesn't it follow then that you should have prepared to have the test there? Because that means the Bahamas is then at an even higher rate of being impacted by this virus, right? So it's absolutely crucial that we get the test to save lives. The lives of Bahamians hang in the balance. On the other end, there's the livelihood of Bahamians that is hanging in the balance. Now, we don't know when America is going to open up, and we don't know when Europe is going to open up, and we shouldn't be looking for when America and Europe is going to open up in and of itself. The longer they stay closed, it's going to impact our hospitality industry. But there are other sectors and other industries in the Bahamas that can function. And as soon as we can get this economy back up and running again, to get persons who can work to be able to work, we need to do that to soften the economic blow. The government's resources are only so far. The business owners' resources can only go so far. The average citizen who is already feeling the brunt of this and understanding now our economic position, unlike America, our economic position prior to this virus was not good. Right. We were already in double-digit unemployment. Dorian had really dealt us a serious blow. Mm-hmm. We were already projecting huge deficits. And there were already a lot of unemployment in those two islands. So imagine now with this and an amount of layoffs, we have to get the people back to work. The testing is not just about dealing with the health crisis, but the testing is also about addressing the economic side of things and getting this economy opened up.
You said a good point, and I want to bring into a conversation, he's a former senator and managing partner of HLBS Galanis and Company, Phil Galanis. I want to bring him into the conversation. Thank you so for joining us on the show tonight. I want to pick up right where the DNA leader left off, and that is the economy. You wrote an article this week in the paper about resetting the economy, and obviously we need to begin thinking about that even as we fight COVID-19. What does a reset economy look like with COVID-19 still being an issue in our country?
Good evening, Clint, and hello, Komolafe. Good evening.
Hi, Galanis. How you doing?
Good, thank you. I wanted to pick up where Komolafe left off, and that essentially is that recognizing that we're living in unprecedented time, there are some things that we can do and must do in order to get the economy going again. First of all, I think we need to recognize that there are three pillars of the economy, namely tourism, financial services, and foreign direct investment, which people don't normally think about as a pillar, but it's a really important segment of our economy, foreign direct investment. They will not be able to reset until we get the virus under control. We've got to recognize that this is going to be with us for quite some time. Firstly, there is going to be a need for us to develop three different plans. First, a short-term plan, which is going to be about 1 to 3 years, a medium-term plan, which will last about 3 to 5 years, and a long-term plan, which will be 5 years and beyond. These three approaches have to be led by the private sector in tandem with the government. And we've got to make certain that while we are trying to find a vaccination or a cure for this illness, that we take care of the many thousands of persons who are unemployed, the elderly, and the mentally and physically challenged. This is going to be critically important if we're going to be able to hold ourselves together, critically important if we're not going to panic, and critically important if we're not going to see a further deterioration of our communities. That'll be evidenced by poverty, serious health illnesses, and emotional and psychological dysfunctions. We also have got cautious that the steps and the measures to take will have to address the potential social unrest that we are seeing in some countries as a result of poor leadership by governments. We saw recently that people were rioting in the streets in South Africa. And so I believe that the intervention by the government has to be both equitable and transparent. It has to be an approach that's bipartisan, and we have to leave the politics out of this. One of the things that we can do as a country is to try as best we can to leave as much money in companies as opposed to taking money out of companies. And so I believe that in the short term, the government will have to seriously consider deferring the payment of that, business licenses and other taxes, and provide some level of forbearance for the period of, say, 3 to 6 months in order to give people an opportunity to save where they can and to retain as much money in the businesses.
I want to take a break right there. I want to take a break, Galanis, right there. We're going to go to a break. When we come back, I want to pick up from there because you touched on an important thing. Waiving VAT and a lot of these taxes, that's the government main revenue. How do we do that, particularly when government is providing so much financial assistance to people who are unemployed? How do we balance that? And I'll get Komalafe's take on that as well right after the break. You're watching me on the headlines. We're back after this. Welcome back to the show. We're talking about resetting the economy and dealing with coronavirus, and plus being able to figure out the way forward for our country. My guest tonight, the DNA leader, Arinthia Komolafe, and of course, expert in giving analysis to our country, and former Senator Phil Galanis. And right before the break, Mr. Galanis, you were talking about the fact that we need to have some waivers and relax areas like that. And I'm thinking this is what the government is depending on to be able to bring relief to people, the thousands of people unemployed. With no tourism and the only dependence probably on taxes like VAT, how is that possible when you have to continuously assist people and you don't want to continue to borrow? How do you manage that?
I think we're going to have to make the very difficult decision of borrowing. We're going to have to borrow more money. We have to recognize that the developed countries like the United States, Canada, and others are borrowing extensive amounts of money. The Bank of England today said that they were going to support the government's efforts to ensure that money is available to the government. And whilst we don't have the capacity to print money as the major developed countries can, we have got to find a way to recognize, we got to recognize firstly that we may have to borrow money. It's going to increase the national debt, but these are extraordinary times and they call for extraordinary measures. While we cannot increase our revenue by increasing taxes, or by while we have the limited ability to borrow money, we should look at ways and means by which we can do so. I believe that the IMF, for example, has had 160 countries make application to that to the IMF in order to get to borrow funds. We've not done so yet. I think we should look at this. We should look at finding ways and means by which to get additional funds into the coffers by borrowing. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that because we cannot borrow, we should look at relieving the pressure on companies to pay their taxes. The payment of VAT, business licenses, and other taxes, the forbearance or sort of the reduction in customs duties, as we did during Hurricane Dorian. These are means by which the government can leave in the businesses if they don't want to borrow money, or look at both of them, try to create a balance between the two of them so that they would be able to, businesses will be able to continue and people's lives will not be adversely impacted as they have been in other countries. We've got to recognize, for example, that we've effectively shut down our tourism sector. The financial services sector is facing tremendous pressure. There are a number of banks that are either laying people off or reducing staff. Cable Bahamas yesterday announced that they're reducing staff by 100 persons, and they're looking at also the executives taking a pay cut. The law firms, I understand, are currently looking at laying off persons, and partners and associates are taking reduction in salary. And so we've got to find innovative ways, not necessarily, and think outside the box. Let's look and see what we have got to do in these circumstances that we would not normally do normal circumstances, because these are not normal circumstances.
Let me ask you, Arinthia Komolafe, what do you propose we do given the circumstances that we are presented with? It's a tough decision for any government.
Absolutely, and these are very, very unusual times, Clint, not just here in the Bahamas, but in the global world. But we're going to have to borrow. We're going to have a mix of different types of relief and concessions in order to get the Bahamian economy back on track. First things first, the global, there's already projections in the global community that there's going to be a 2.5% contraction of the global of GDP. So we already know that a lot of economies are already suffering as a result of this. China starting this whole, China being at the top because they're the ones that experience this virus at first. We are now living in a low interest environment. Central banks around the world, the United States, Canada, in Europe, they are cutting interest rates to near zero, making it easier for persons to be able to gain access to capital, making it easier for sovereign debt as well to be accessible to the leaders of the world. We are going to have to borrow, there's no question about it. Another part of that, we are also going to have to give some concessions on taxes, because if we don't take the pill now, if the government doesn't take the pill, it's going to be worse, because the government cannot sustain taking care of everybody in the economy. They're gonna have to provide some incentives for businesses to be able to keep persons employed, and they're going to have to be able to give concessions on VAT taxes, whether it's business license taxes, all of that they're going to have to do to help persons to remain employed. The borrowing, the concessions, and Clint, yes, we're going to have to do some spending. The government, this is what you call necessary borrowing, necessary spending, and absolutely a cut in taxes. Now, I hope the government listens to this time, because the first time we said in 2017, do not increase the taxes because you're going to have external shocks. And we talked about hurricanes, and disaster preparedness goes beyond hurricanes now in this environment, as we are seeing now with this virus. We didn't have much buffer, But the reality is now, what we had, because we didn't have much buffer, because we increased the taxes and we took more money out of the economy. And now we find ourselves again hit with another disaster. It's not even a year yet. We cannot increase taxes. That is the worst thing that we can do in this environment. We have to cut taxes. We have to provide concessions to businesses so they can keep persons employed. We have to spend. But when we borrow these funds and when we spend, we have to have a plan for how we're going to do this. And this is a great time for us to press the reset button to invest in those industries that we've been calling for the government to invest in for decades now. And this is the opportunity for us to expand industries and expand the sectors that can contribute to gross domestic product, whether that is farming and agriculture and moving toward food security, looking at our natural resources to sustain our people and moving forward to a sovereign wealth fund, a true sovereign wealth fund, and also investing in the creative and the blue, the orange and the blue economies so that we are able to withstand shocks. That is what we've been calling for. When I was the managing director of the Bahamas Development Bank, this is what I presented to the previous Minister of Finance and the Prime Minister. We needed to move toward just relying on the tourism sector and foreign direct investment. And I'm not saying we need to get rid of them because we need them, but we needed to provide a buffer for more productive industries so that they would be able to withstand external shocks as the ones that we are experiencing now. That would have called for more light manufacturing. That would have called for an expansion in our capacity to be able to have food security. Those are the industries that create more sustainable jobs, and those are the industries, as we are seeing around the world now, is able to sustain the people of those nations in the time of crisis.
All right, well, we got to go.
Yes. If I could just make one final point. Let's
Sure.
keep in mind that the small and medium-sized businesses in this country represent about 80% of all businesses in the economy. That is 80% of that. When I say small businesses, I'm talking about businesses that are defined with annual income of less than $3 million. Now, if just consider 80% of our businesses that have that level of revenue being impacted, we think initially or principally only of the major sector, that is tourism, which is significantly important and significant and important. But we also must recognize that there are some things that could be done to assist those small and medium-sized businesses. I think that when we, and that's again why I said that we need a three-prong approach to this: a short-term, a short-term approach, an intermediate-term approach, and a long-term approach. Some of the things which Komolafe has spoken about, Arinthia has spoken about, really are going to fall within the intermediate or long-term approach to how we deal with the economy and how we re-engineer the economy. We're going to have to look at very, very closely at coming outside, thinking outside the box that we have in the past, and looking exclusively at the primary industries of tourism and financial services. We've got to find ways and means by which to help to impact those 80% of the companies that represent small and medium-term businesses, because that's really when the rubber hits the road. That's where the majority of our employees actually work. And so again, much has to be done. A lot of planning has to go on. We've got to take long views and recognize that as we move back into our work environment, we've got to continue in the short term to take whatever prophylactic steps we can to ensure that the people who return to work are not going to contribute to a second phase of the outbreak, continued outbreak of the coronavirus epidemic.
All right, great stuff. Philip Glanis, thank you for joining me. Arinthia Komolafe, thank you for your contributions tonight. We appreciate it.